European Imperialism, Lesson 6.2. What does the European treatment of people that they came into contact with reveal about their worldview? We'll take a look at some previous knowledge that we've got from other chapters and from last year and apply that to our concept today. So stick around and let's learn something. Welcome to lesson 6.2. What does the Europeans' treatment of peoples they came into contact with reveal about their worldview? So we're going to get started talking about European imperialism, the Treaty of Tortosila. And this, you can see this on the map here. We've got the map, we've got this line, the treaty line. Everything to the west of that line belongs to Spain. Everything to the east of that line belongs to Portugal, goes right through Brazil. That's why in Brazil they're speaking Portuguese and not Spanish today. So that's a direct effect today of this treaty. But anyways, this treaty happened because both Spain and Portugal were going out on expeditions because they wanted to find these routes to Asia. Asia had everything that the Europeans wanted. They had everything for trade, and they both were having this desire to get the best, quickest, fastest, easiest route to Asia. Well, what they didn't know is that the Americas stood in their way. So you got North and South America that's there. So when the Europeans, air quotations, discovered these two continents, they couldn't decide on how to divide this, again, air quotations, new land. So what do? Well, both being very Catholic, they went to the Pope. So in 1494, so 2 years after Columbus sets sail, the Pope takes a map, divides the world, and says, okay, everything to the west of this line belongs to Spain. Everything to the east of this line is going to belong to Portugal in terms of new land. So who is this going to upset? Well, number one, who gives the Pope the right to do this? Number two, if somebody does have the right to do this, who's got the right to do this over indigenous people that are already living in these lands? And it's also going to make, number three, other countries very upset, specifically the countries of England and France. They are now upset with the Pope, and they're like, hey, wait a second. I don't think so, Pope. We are going to actually ignore what you're saying, and we're going to go out and send our explorers, and we're going to lay claim to our own land, right? So now we see many European countries being pulled into this power struggle, wanting new territories, wanting resources, and wanting to control people that they meet along the way. And we talk about in Unit 2 what happens to these people that they meet along the way. So we're taking charge is what is next. And the first country to Central and South America was Spain, and they were very creative in the name of this new area. They called it New Spain, very creative. And they were, like the other Europeans at that time, they were very ethnocentric. So this ethnocentrism caused the slavery of millions of indigenous people. And these indigenous people were forced to work the land, and they were severely punished if they didn't comply to the demands of the Europeans. And the demands of the indigenous were so great that oftentimes they were worked to death. Yeah, Mr. Philip, that was a long time ago. That was a long time ago. We don't need to worry about that. But it still kind of is in existence today. We still have imperialism today. It's economic imperialism. If you take a look at the clothes that you wear, the devices that you have and things like that, most of them are made in developing countries. And they're made in developing countries because the wages paid to workers are super low. We call those sweatshops. And from a brand's point of view, they'll argue saying that, yeah, we're paying them low, but they're making more for us, working for us, than they would if they weren't working for us. So there's a little bit of a there's two sides. There's the brand side. They're trying to justify the wrongs that they are doing, and then there's those of us, the consumers, that are saying, "Hey, this is not a good thing. We should not be doing this. This is bad." So what the Europeans were doing to the indigenous, no doubt, was horrible. But there's this guy, Bartolomeu de las Casas, and he's a priest, a Spanish priest, and he was witnessing these atrocities firsthand. He was witnessing all of these crimes firsthand that the Spanish were doing against the indigenous groups that they encountered. And he wrote about this, and he sent these writings to the king, to the Spanish king, pleading and appealing the king to improve the working conditions of these indigenous people that the Spanish are meeting, and explaining all of the bad things that are happening. And the Spanish king approves. He's like, yeah, you know what? We are going to improve the lives of our First Nations that we meet and the indigenous that we meet. But the problem was, this didn't last very long. And unfortunately, it only lasted 3 years. And all the hard work that Bartolomeu de las Casas tried to do and did just kind of unraveled. And then the Europeans continued back to their old ways. One of the things that they wanted was treasure, imperialist treasure. And they were determined to conquer every group that they came in contact with. We will learn in the next unit that one of those groups are the Aztecs, the other group is the Inca, and they wanted all of the resources, and they wanted to control the people. And they weren't very nice about doing this either. The outcome was that Spain became super wealthy. They went from a very poor country in 1492 to an economic superpower. And they were using the mines of the Aztecs, and especially that of the Inca, to ship thousands of tons of gold and silver, emeralds, back to Spain. And now Spain is a super, super rich country. They would fill these Spanish galleons with all of these riches and bring them back, and Spain's economy skyrocketed. But as our opening story, you'll remember, it wasn't so easy for Spain because the English were aware of what was happening. And the English ships, their fleet was very small. They were small, fast, and maneuverable. The fleet itself wasn't small, but the ships were small. And this was perfect for attacking those Spanish galleons. They could easily get onto those galleons, steal the treasure, and get back onto those ships very quickly and suffering minimal damage. And the English constantly were raiding Spanish ships. They were constantly raiding Spanish ports to get these riches. And the Queen Elizabeth I, as we saw in the opening story, was in 100% support of these actions. And of course, who's not? Well, Spain is against this, completely against this. But their protests fell on deaf ears, and the English continued to do these raidings. There's a terrible cost when it comes to European imperialism. And before the arrival of the Europeans, especially here the Spanish, the Aztecs and the Incas, they had very successful, advanced, thriving civilizations. And within 100 years of making contact with the Europeans, that all changed. It's estimated that 90 million indigenous people died at the hands of Europeans. Many died of diseases, so they didn't have immunity to many of the European diseases. And whole groups died out. It says here, remember the Beothuk from grade 7 that were in Newfoundland? Like, they were completely wiped out. So they died of disease, and they not only that, but of the treating of indigenous people. The Europeans, with that ethnocentrism, they wiped out millions upon millions of indigenous people. Death, disease, and destruction wiped out 90% of the indigenous people in the air quotations New World. And how do we know a lot about this? Well, we know this not because of the Spanish chronicles that were left behind. The written records that any indigenous may have had, either pictures or whatnot, all of that was destroyed by the Spanish. There's no surprise there. The people that were left, the remaining 10% of the population, the indigenous population that were left, they learned Spanish and they passed on this history, okay, from one generation to the other. We learned all about that in grade 7 social studies. But the quipu was a very important way of telling this indigenous story. And it's these oral traditions, but the quipu is this long rope that you see there with these strands and these knots, and each one represents a part of that oral history, that oral story. And the indigenous were sure to keep these stories alive, and they used the quipu to do that. So how do we know that these atrocities happened? How do we know that these things happened? Well, we do have the written accounts of many of the Spanish. We also have the oral history that lines up with the indigenous groups. All right, I want you to head over to your notebook and complete the questions for this part of the chapter.